Good morning. Welcome to this presentation of Teaching People Looking Critically at Historical Figures. This is the presentation we would have done on Tuesday in class, I think. And I'm going to substitute it for the MAPS module this week on tracks, just so we can kind of catch up. Whatever you do not know about MAPS, just bone up on, because you might be asked about it in your certification test. And you may also be required to teach it. But we will not talk about MAPS this summer session for this social studies course. Today we are going to look at those people in the TEKS, some of those people in the TEKS actually, that are significant in history. Most of it is going to come from Texas history, so it'll be 4th or 7th grade that you would encounter a lot of these people and the requirement to teach historical figures, but there are other grade levels with other significant people mentioned in them, and this is just a kind of an idea of how to teach little kids about these historical figures that may not seem real to your students. You might need a piece of paper or a pen or pencil to jot down some notes. I am going to upload this to Tracks, as well as with the graphic organizer that I mentioned in graphic organizers that I mentioned in this presentation. So be sure to follow directions and ask questions if necessary via email. Let's get started. Teaching People Looking Critically at Historical Figures. Look at the images on the screen and see if you can identify these people and one object by name. I'll be silent for a few seconds so that you can look at them and see who you may recognize. Okay, coming back. This at the top left is W.E.B. Du Bois. You'll find him in the 5th grade TEKS. He is slave abolitionist, very prolific writer, was a well-educated Black man in the United States during the post-Civil War era. Very important to maintaining Black history in the United States. In the center here is Spindletop, the first major oil rig in Texas. I don't remember the date on that one, so you'll have to look that one up. But Spindletop is the first major oil rig in Texas. The lady on the right at the top is Irma Rangel. She has passed, but she is a former Hispanic congresswoman in Texas. So she's a Texas congresswoman and was the first Hispanic woman to serve in Texas Congress. This is former President Teddy Roosevelt, who, in my opinion, was most significant for establishing our national parks system in the United States. This lady here with the Texas flag is our former, technically second female governor of Texas, Ann Richards. Oops. And lastly, here on the bottom right is Sam Houston, and you should recognize him from your research while doing your Journey Box for Texas history and the Texas Revolution. So as a teacher, as a pre-service teacher, you might still be thinking, well, who am I supposed to teach? That's specifically designated by what is in the standards that Texas says all of your students should have accomplished by the end of their grade level year. So you essentially teach the names or the people who are named in the TEKS. There's never, it's not an exhaustive list by any means. So if there are others that you feel you should add in, that's up to your discretion. At this point, though, it's important to note that what is in the TEKS is generally what is expected to be tested on the STAR test. If you see the image here on this slide, that is a quote, an image from Cesar Chavez. The quote, "The fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It's always about people." Cesar Chavez, if you know much about him, you would know that he was a political rights activist, a human rights activist for migrant workers who were being mistreated by owners of farms and plantations, specifically in Southern California and the southern states west of Texas. Migrant workers will come up from Mexico, work on farms until the crops are all taken care of, and then they move on to the next situation so that they can continue to work and earn money. At one point in our history, these people were living in hovel, terrible conditions, were not paid fairly, were mistreated physically, were not given food during the day or breaks to obtain food. So Cesar Chavez picked up the fight for these people and was actually able to begin unions and other protections for these workers. So who do you teach? If the name appears in the TEKS, that's where you're going to start. Remember that the TEKS are not terribly diverse. There is some, like you did in your slot analysis, you see some discrepancies between maybe it's heavy on the white male and doesn't see the other side of the story. So remember that there is a lack of diversity and some superficiality in the standards. And of course, again, anybody you think you need to teach that would be important to your students. If your students are asking to learn about someone, absolutely add that to your curriculum. How do you teach historical figures? One of the most important things that a history teacher can do for their students is to make history alive for that student. So to humanize someone who you would never meet physically in person, to make that person seem like a real person is the best way to get students interested and to capture their attention. So by telling the flaws that this person might have had, or talking about how they lived their lives on an everyday situation, and how students would see these people as an average human beings that just saw an injustice or decided to run for president or wanted to make a difference in their community, how they are as human beings. On this slide, you see a quote from Susan B. Anthony, and she says, because she is such a fantastic supporter of women's rights, "I have encountered riotous mobs and have been hung in effigy, but my motto is, men's rights are nothing more, women's rights are nothing less." I'm going to further the conversation about Susan B. Anthony momentarily while I kind of humanize her for you. I don't know how much you know about Susan B. Anthony, but I want to give you some more information and kind of make it in a way where I'm analyzing her character, analyzing who she is in an everyday, normal person kind of way. So here's a slight short biography of Susan B. Anthony. We can consider Susan Brownell Anthony one of the original leaders of the Me Too movement. She was born to Quaker parents on February 15, 1820. Susan B. Anthony was a, quote, pioneer crusader for women's suffrage movement in the United States, and her diligence and doggedness helped pave the way for the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. She was one of those kids who blew you away when you met them. She was very precocious, very interested in everything. She was reading and writing by the time she was 3 years old. She went on to graduate from seminary in upstate New York and worked as a teacher for a while until she met people like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, who were abolitionists who were out fighting for slave rights. And she decided that she had something to say about that. So she started speaking out about slave rights. But it was while she was doing these speaking engagements about human rights in regards to slaves, she met her BFF, who became her BFF, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who bonded over their common experiences as women during this time in history. So they bonded over women's suffrage. One time, when Susan was planning to speak at a temperance meeting, which is where the committee was discussing what to do about people drinking, this was in 1852. She was planning to speak, but before her turn, she was told that she couldn't speak. She was not allowed to speak because she was a woman. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Susan was so angered by this that this just further fanned her flames to fight for injustice. And she created a society called the Women's New York Temperance Society, where she led meetings, wrote and published important speeches, and dived deeper into her advocacy for women and women's rights. She was bullied. She was abused. She was even arrested for voting in a presidential election. She was arrested and jailed and found out after the fact that even before her trial, the judge had made his decision. Even before he met her, he had made his decision that he was going to jail her for voting. She soldiered on. She was determined and not going to let any negative bring her down when it came to this fight, because she believed so much in equal rights for everyone. She did begin publishing a periodical called Revolution that continued her advocacy, and she went on to speak. But then she retired at 80 years old. She did this for a very, very long time. 80 years old was when she retired, and then she died 6 years later on March 13th, 1906. The results of her lifelong advocacy and fight for equal rights came to fruition in 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Hopefully you have a little more information about Susan B. Anthony that maybe you didn't have before. And hopefully you have an image in your mind of what she kind of looked like as she was going through her life and fighting so hard for something that we now, as American citizens, kind of take advantage of. If you don't vote, what do you think you're doing to all of this that Susan B. Anthony kind of stood up for? So that's a conversation you could add into your humanizing these historical figures and make it real and real time for your students. Moving on. So when you humanize your figures and you are teaching biographical information, there are lots of ways that you can do that. But once the students have the information, there are other things and extensions that you can do with your students so that they use the information and get into it. The image that you see on your screen is Malala. She is a Pakistani young lady who is now in her 20s, who was shot in the head while riding a bus to school by a group of, I think it was Taliban terrorists in Pakistan. She survived her shooting, obviously, and has gone on to speak out for, again, women's rights and girls' rights, where she created an educational foundation to allow girls to continue to go to school in Pakistan. She is very, very, very about the world, about advocacy for fair education for everyone and for women's rights. If you don't know much about her, we might get a little bit more into that in just a moment. Here are some extensions that you could do with your students to further historical figures biography. You could write a timeline of that person's life. Write a script and create a documentary. Open mind notes is something we're going to look at in just a second. Creating a fictional or nonfiction book about that person. Host a living history museum where your students would play the role of a historical figure. Create posters, art, and street art honoring those figures. This is one of the graphic organizers you might could use, something similar to this, and getting into the feelings and emotions of what these people might have felt further helps humanize them. In this example, it's an enslavement graphic organizer, so the students would be expected to think like a slave. How would they have felt? What did they hear? What were they seeing? What did they say? To kind of get the students thinking of how these people were actually living their lives. Another is an I am poem from the perspective of that historical figure. And then I will show you an image of the open mind portrait. You're going to do one of these for this assignment. I'm going to give you a list of names of historical figures that I want you to focus on. You can choose one of those historical figures. And then what I want you to do is learn a little bit about that person, enough so that you can humanize that person. And then I want you to, in the image here on this graphic organizer, draw pictures, symbols, and images. And you can even write words if you think that would be more appropriate to show your thoughts and feelings, to show what you think that person, your historical figure that you've chosen, is thinking. Ignore all of the directions in this one. So pick a person, do a little research, and then on this graphic organizer within the head, you are thinking like that person and putting what they're thinking on this piece of paper. And then at the bottom, where there are some free lines to write their biography as you would teach it to a group of elementary school kids. Let me know what questions you have. If you need me, please feel free to contact me. I will be on campus today, which is Friday, and otherwise we'll be home this weekend. So let me know what you need. Good luck. I will see you on Monday. Thanks so much for paying attention.